My name's Rose. I haven't actually met many of you before, so thank you for having us. I'm here because earlier this year, Darren and Daniel and I ran a panel similar to this for a very different audience at a state-based writers' centre. So my background is in stories and writing. I'm a journalist, and I probably wouldn't say a gamer yet, given I've only been doing it for a couple of years, and I feel like I lack a lot of the fundamental expertise that certainly these guys have. But I'm going to introduce you to all of them, even though you're probably familiar with them. At the very end, we've got Daniel Wilkins from Hyper Magazine, who currently
Everyone gets my name wrong, sorry. Daniel Wilks, W-I-L-K-S, no E.
Got it? Daniel Wilks, who I'll be referring to as Daniel from now on in fear.
Or Wilks, yeah. Or Wilkenstein, or that guy, fat dude, whatever.
Yeah, or something like that. And then we've got Dan Staines, who's currently doing his PhD on video games and ethics at the University of New South Wales. Darren Wells, who is the editor of Xbox Magazine, but has written across platforms and across consoles for I think over a decade now. To my right is Dr. Malcolm Ryan, who teaches game design at New South Wales Uni and apparently is pretty much the games faculty there. And on the far end is Dan McMahon, who's written for Team Bondi and also for Kennedy Miller and is currently freelancing. So it's a really big topic, so we're going to jump right into it with a painfully broad question, which we're going to start with Daniel because I got his name wrong. And just talk about...
So I get punished.
And just talk about, I guess, which game we think does narratives in a really interesting way.
Oh,
so
God.
pick any game you
like. Yeah, that's nice and broad. Narrative in an interesting way. Well, like the two games I always go back to when talking about this topic, pretty much opposite ends of the spectrum. One tells a story quite, didactically. The other one tells it organically through your actions. Those being Bastion and Dark Souls. Bastion has hands up who's played it. Okay, I don't have to explain it, it's really good. It has a narrator that narrates in real time what you're doing. So you feel like you're part of the story. So whilst you're following this very linear story, it feels like your own because your actions become part of the ongoing story. Dark Souls, on the other hand, has a little bit of narrative, but the real story of it is this, Sisyphean quest to get to the end. It's extremely hard, and that difficulty, the fact that you will die over and over again, you will learn from your deaths, really kind of becomes the narrative of the game. And it also has an interesting multiplayer aspect where people can leave messages in your, well, they can invade your world and try and kill you, but they can also leave messages. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes not so much. Somebody might say, skeletons over here, like warning you of evil around a corner. Or someone might decide to be a bit of a dick and just put a message saying that there's treasure if you jump here. And you can just watch the ghosts of people who have leapt over Lover's Leap. It's these stories kind of grow out of the mechanics of the game. Whereas the story itself is ancient evils, gotta kill it. It's quite trite. But what people do in the game leads to a bunch of really interesting narratives.
It's kind of interesting that you bring up both Bastion and Dark Souls as examples of good narrative in game, because what you have in both cases is an attempt to solve ludonarrative dissonance, which, if you're not familiar with the term, although I assume most of you are, is the idea that game mechanics gameplay conflicts with a narrative in a way that undermines both. And so what you have with Bastion, I was actually speaking to the writer of Bastion recently, Greg Kasavin, and he was saying the narrator conceit in Bastion came up as a result of problem solving. Basically, they were faced with the problem of ludonarrative dissonance and how to marry gameplay to narrative in a meaningful way and in a non-conflicting way. And what happened is, they came up with this idea, the narrator, as a way to solve that problem, because the narrator narrates your actions in the game, or in a way, he doesn't actually narrate your actions so much, but his narration is kind of vague enough that you feel that it applies to what you're doing in the game. And Dark Souls, on the other hand, solves that problem by more or less doing away with narrative altogether and leaving the player to generate their own narrative. And so you don't get that conflict there because there isn't a strong authorial developer-instituted narrative to conflict with what the player does. The player generates their own, and it's internally consistent because of that.
Like most of the story that's given in Dark Souls is more through history, through item descriptions, brief conversations you might have with a trader that kind of hints at the fact that the way he's got all his gear is that up till you getting there, everyone he's encountered he's just murdered and stole their crap. Like, it's more world building than it is straight up narrative. The expansion pack to it, Archerius of the Abyss, I think it was called, had a lot more story, but it kind of harkened back to earlier gameplay design where a whole bunch of the story was just given it to you at the beginning. It's like, all these things happened, and go and kill monsters. So, you know,
it's a good point that you raise in actually, you know, drawing a divide. Bastion and Dark Souls sort of helps to draw the divide between, you know, narrative, and you were talking about that sort of authorial presence, actual writing, because the writing in Dark Souls is execrable.
Oh, it's awful, isn't it?
Absolutely abysmal.
But it doesn't matter because the player constructs their own
Yeah,
narrative.
exactly. So, you know, in the complete absence of, you know, any kind of grasp of the English language, which is forgivable because that's where it was made.
Japanese developed game where they use kind of ye old English.
So, and you know, which is fun because you end up with bosses named things like Endless Discharge, which is cool. But you're right in saying that, you know, in the absence of that, players are left to create their own narrative, and they do, and it, you know, produces really interesting results.
And it is interesting how complex narratives can actually get in the way of the gameplay. So the game that probably one of my favourite games and also one of my favourite techs is probably the original BioShock game, which is beautiful and complicated and has levels on multiple, stories on multiple levels, both explicitly through the radio recordings but also built into the little skirmishes and levels and the writing on the wall that you see. But that's actually got a major problem in terms of how the gameplay and the story narrative work together. So it's interesting that this has come up from the very beginning, this idea about marrying the two well, which is both Dark Souls and Bastion do probably fairly well. But I know, Darren, you are quite fond of Metal Gear Solid, which does storytelling in a really interesting way, quite differently from the games we've mentioned so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's an older game, it's an old school approach, it's gameplay cutscene, and it's a linear story as well. There's none of this branching narrative that we have today. And I'm totally okay with linear stories because to me that is an example of the developer or the writer saying what they want to say. It's their message and I'm experiencing it the way that they want to tell their story. I don't feel a need in that instance to think as though I'm the one creating that narrative, that this is my story.
Oh,
Hey man, Darren, I like you.
I totally agree. I when someone's got great authorial intent and they tell me a good story, you know, something I've said for years is tell me a story and I'll love you forever. One of my favorite stories in games. It's painfully linear. There is no change in it. Is Max Payne 2. It's perfect. It's self-contained. It goes for about 7.5 hours. It's a tragic love story with lots of murder, as all love stories should have, I think, to spice them up. But like, it's just so self-contained, and you feel justified at every step of the way. Like, there is no need for branching storylines and finding out greater depth about things. It's just like, yeah, just this rocket ride through a tragic love story.
What's interesting about
With
Metal Gear Solid is that even though, yeah, it is quite strict in the way it tells its narrative and there's no real player construction of narrative in it, it still gives you little tools to put your personal touch on the narrative to give you a bit of power. So for example, during cutscenes you can press one of the buttons and change the perspective. go to look through it through the protagonist's eyes or through someone else's eyes, or you can move the camera around with the right thumbstick.
Yeah.
There's sort of these little things that remind you that even though you're not in control, you still have a degree of power in how you experience a narrative and how you see it.
Yeah. Malcolm, what about you? I think.
I play, so I don't play as many of the big mainstream games as I'm not a proper gamer in that sense.
You
I play a lot
hipster.
of weird things. I know.
Look at the hat.
So I'm gonna, yeah, that's fair. So I'm gonna bring up some obscure games that you've never heard of and challenge Chris to find footage of them. So in terms of one of my favourite narrative moments in a game is actually in text adventure game. Who's ever played a text adventure game, kids? Oh wow, that's great. There's a whole modern underground text adventure making thing, and there's one out by, I think it's Aaron Reed. I'm not sure if that name is right. I'm very bad with names normally. Blue Lacuna, and it's a weird little story, kind of about magic and family and strange things. But you start in this scene with this with another person who is your lover, and you're living in this log cabin in the woods, and then it sort of plays out like in a normal text adventure way that you're wandering around doing usual things, and then there's this cut scene where essentially a cut scene in a text adventure, where it cuts quickly from that time to a time in the future, and it does it by playing out, giving you a little paragraph that says, and you were in the high woods above your cabin, and you saw smoke, and then it just says ... and you have the time to type in one word, and then it takes that word. And so I saw that, and I typed in run towards the house, and when you get there you see that it is on fire, and it was just this running story that it just prompted me every now and then to type the next word, and I automatically typed the word, and the word that I typed fit into the story that I wanted to tell, and it.
How flexible is that? So for
I
example,
don't know,
if it
I
said,
didn't go
and
back
you,
and go-
and you type fart.
Yeah. But I think it's because it's the role of the narrative, and you just want to type the right word next. And they went to the final moment where I think your partner was hurt, and it said and I typed in cry, and I didn't even stop to think of it. It was just a natural thing to do, and that fit. And it felt amazing because that's the first time I'd ever cried in a video game as the action and had the game respond to me as that was the right thing for me to do. And it was beautiful because they'd scripted it. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I haven't gone back, but I'm pretty sure the same things happen almost exactly, but they'd scripted it with an awareness of my psychology and what I was going to type. So I didn't feel like, oh yeah, okay, what do I do now? Okay, I guess the right thing to solve this puzzle is cry. It's just like, no, I wanted to cry, so I cried, and it responded to me. And that's like one of the most powerful experiences, because it felt like I was doing it, but it really responded in a way that made sense. So it was completely manipulative. It knew it was pushing all my buttons, but great, that was fabulous.
And that kind of goes back to the point we were making before about the gamers, and so we all seem to respond quite well to authorial intent. So you were responding back to the game, which I guess was programmed to elicit the kind of responses you were giving it, and that's why it worked.
Yeah.
And I think what becomes really interesting with games that we don't get in books or screenplays or a lot of other text types is this relationship where you've kind of got to, as a developer and a writer, grapple with the player and how they're going to understand and accept the story. And I think in your case, you did really well with that one.
Yeah.
And they probably did quite well in crafting it well as well. But I think one of the big games that always pops up at this point is Mass Effect and the endings and that drama, and I'm seeing lots of strong facial expressions. So for those who aren't aware, Mass Effect, 3-part series, a lot of people didn't like the ending, huge petitions, months of complaining, and I guess an extended cut was released that kind of tweaked the ending but didn't fundamentally change it
Yeah, it didn't add a whole lot.
much.
Huh.
How do we feel about that?
I really like Mass Effect, and I was more or less indifferent to the ending. I thought it was reasonable. The big problem with the Mass Effect ending that I had is that it's not so much that the ending itself was poor, it's that they failed to connect the end states in any meaningful way to the choices you make up until that point. So for example, it works on a war asset system, I think the system was called, whereby you go around to each planet and you collect these resources, and eventually the amount of resources that you have determines the option that you have at the ending, whether or not you get to go down one of 3 paths. And what they failed to do with that is demonstrate how what you're collecting, how these war assets connect to your choices. So ultimately the choices felt a bit arbitrary to me.
I mean, there's always been a series to some extent that has been written and scripted by, obviously BioWare scriptwriters, but it's always had the illusion that the player is in control of the story or Shepard's journey. And it was only at the end point of Mass 3 where control, I think, was reined back too much towards BioWare's side, towards their writer's side, because they wanted to end the story on their terms rather than the rest of the series, which has normally been on the player's terms.
I really wish that game ended, because the before your ending, where you're on Earth in the war-strewn area, and you have those final closure moments with different people, and I felt that quite powerful. And I almost would have liked the game to have ended with losing the war, and there was just destruction, and that was because that would have actually been a beautiful way of ending it. Like, you'd had
Roman
this
Polanski's Mass Effect.
the last infuriatingly long portion as well, because you have to limp everywhere, and it's like when you lose that final battle and the light comes down and boom, Earth explodes.
Well, that's
Game
that's
over.
good.
I would have been happy.
That's an interesting point, because you have this there's kind of this fundamental tension that, games get harder as you get towards the end. But as you get towards the end of a narrative, you want to maintain that pacing, you want to maintain the kind of momentum that you've built up to that point. But if the game is so hard that you're constantly dying and constantly restarting, it ends up removing that tension, that momentum, and so ultimately you sort of just stop caring after a little while.
Especially in terms of how action narratives work. In a book, you'll notice as it gets more exciting, the sentences get shorter, which means you're breathing more, which is speeding up your heart rate. And the same thing happens with screenshots in a movie. But often at the end of a video game, you're injured, or you're slowing down, or you're fighting big battles, so it's actually taking longer. So games actually often physically are putting you through a process that can actually be other than mentally quite alarming. It's actually not helping you get physically ramped up for the battle, unless it's one of those, like the absurdly long thing on the warship at the end of Bioshock Infinite, which goes on and on and on, and there's fire from multiple directions, because that does have the panicking effect and the rapid breathing. But actually, because when you're tired or damaged, you're slowing down significantly, and that's an interesting challenge that games have, which is that books can really quite manipulate how you are breathing and responding. And games...
It's just a really interesting point that at those stages, it's the job, when you're working in prose, at those stages your job is to take the prose and get it out of the way. Whereas you reach the later climactic stages in a game, the game's job is to get in the way. Which is a really, really good point.
How do you resolve that? Have there been any games that adequately resolve that tension?
You put it on very easy.
Yeah.
That's
actually it's a good solution.
Incidentally, Mass Effect 2 did something very interesting at the end of that game. It's possible to finish the game and fail at the same time. You just finish with high cost to your emotional, I guess. A lot of people you care about will die, but you will still save the world.
Morden's dead, restart.
Whereas in a completely linear narrative, you can only encounter more and more friction towards the end of the game if you want to.
A game that I think actually did, unfortunately, towards the end, it got very grindy, but the actual end, it summed up everything very well, is Planescape Torment. Who's played Planescape Torment? Ooh, hardly anyone. Okay, one of the best games ever made. Play it. It's a game that actually seriously suffers from linear narrative dissonance, because the developers had a really interesting story, and then they did a deal with I think it was TSR at the time, who was still owning the D&D franchise, to turn it into a D&D game and set it in the Planescape expansion universe, rather than the universe they'd come up with. So they had to basically collect lots of D&D style combat and encounters and monsters and stuff like that, and a story that's about a guy trying to find out why he's immortal. So this deeply philosophical story that they end up fitting in with heaps of combat.
Mm.
But it got really interesting in the fact that whereas nearly every RPG has boss battles, it did as well. There was only one you couldn't talk your way out of, including the final battle against the big ultimate evil.
Fallout 1 did that well.
Yeah,
as
Fallout
well.
1 did it really fantastically.
I talked my way through the final scene of Fallout 1, and it was harrowing. The conversation that I had was, it was awful.
Well,
The
that's
story is
the thing about Planescape Torment. Like, you find out why you're immortal, and it's horrifying. Like, I don't want to give away spoilers because it is something I think anyone interested in story in games should experience. It's a better story than it is a game. As a game, it's average. As a story, it's amazing.
Yeah, see, to me, Planescape is basically a really good book
Yeah.
wrapped around a game.
Yeah, it's a 1,000,000-word book wrapped around 30 hours of rather tedious D&D.
Dialogue is one of the things that games can have a lot of fun with because it's not too hard to build in, and it's one of the easier. You guys would probably know this better than I would, but apparently it's one of the easier things to program multiple responses to. So I just recently played, I think it's probably quite old, it's that game where the statue comes to life.
Galatea?
Yeah, and apparently it's got 70 endings, based on primarily dialogue, which you can get to different points with. But then we've got games which are pretty much just dialogue in terms of storytelling. So
The tricky thing, I know you want to show facade. I won't jump on there, but so I do research in artificial intelligence and storytelling and so forth, and that's not facade.
That's bad dude versus dragon.
Just put that image up and leave it.
One of the things that's really hard there is that I mean, I guess what feels unnatural about the problem I have with dialogue in games is that it's so stilted because dialogue is never about choosing A, B, or C. If you're having a real conversation, I don't have 3 options of what to say to you. Dialogue is actually a real conversation is a real nuanced game, especially when you're having a careful conversation, which many of the dramatic situations are. You've got to pick the right words. Whereas when if I'm faced with a difficult situation and I have to pick, say the nice thing, say the mean thing, I don't know, say something else. That's not dialogue to me.
I also messed up most of The Walking Dead by being kind of story hungry the whole time, so picking a really obvious option where I just kept getting told stuff.
Yeah.
Which is one of the limitations, because you're like, oh, now I kind of know what's going on, and I'm slowing it down, and it's getting boring. But again, when you've only got a couple of options for speaking, it really does mess with it. But I think Darren mentioned this game Facade in our.
We've gone back to
Oh.
Sorry. Chris is having trouble keeping up with us.
This is a good time to do a live play.
Yes.
Yeah.
How many people have played Facade? Okay.
Okay. So yeah, for those who aren't aware, this is a game maybe about 10 years old now. It's an indie sort of experiment, I guess, in dynamic narrative in games. And so contrary to most games where there's a B or C dialogue choice, Facade lets you type in real time any response you want. And I guess maybe because of that freedom in the conversation engine, the story and the setting is rather limited. It's one apartment setting and you're talking to a couple who have had problems in their relationship. So that's kind of the story, but the narrative that comes out of that setting is totally up to you, the player, and what happens during your responses. So like maybe
It's loading.
jump on.
Loading. Take
I don't have audio.
We don't have audio?
Well, I mean, just while we're waiting for Facade to load or something, what I really like about Facade, I think it kind of fails as a game, basically because natural language processing, which is what Facade tries to do, is really, really hard. What I do like about Facade, though, is that it's very grounded. It tells a very kind of almost a mundane narrative. Basically, the narrative is that this couple is having problems, and you've been involved in that. What I think one of the big problems with game narratives right now is that they're too focused on the epic, they're too focused on these massive stories about saving the universe, about saving the world, when really the more interesting stories, the stories that we experience on a day-to-day basis in our lives, are personal and grounded, and not necessarily about doing great heroic things.
Well, on that point, While I was waiting, I actually heard some people discussing Dragon Age and Dragon Age 2 and the hatred of Dragon Age 2. I actually much prefer the story of Dragon Age 2 because it's a personal story.
Yeah, likewise.
It's a story of one person trying to protect their family. They're not trying to save the world, they're not trying to change political systems, they're just trying to do what they can to save their family. And I like that, it makes it contained. The fact that it all seems to happen in 4 rooms and 6 different streets shut me up the wall, but the story itself I thought was excellent.
This is probably the point for me to admit that I'm a massive, massive Halo fan.
Good for you.
Unashamed of that. But, you know, in playing Halo 4, you realise that you remember that you were really, really enamoured of the story experiences in ODST and in Halo Reach. I thought they were really, really brilliant. And you played Halo 4 and you remembered, hang on a second, the stories in numbered Halo games are complete nonsense.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten this. I've heard it described as the all story, which is a really good, as you say, they shoot for epicness, and you end up with every single game having the same story where there's an ancient race of beings and now a chosen one whose job it is to save
And
the
a
world.
magic widget. There's
And a-
always a magic widget.
And a magic wizard, yes.
I think what developers sometimes forget is that in stories, humans are the interesting part. People are, not
Absolutely.
necessarily events.
Absolutely. Which is,
Can you play this without audio? It doesn't seem to.
Not-
No, it's kind of a talky game.
No.
Does it have subtitles?
Yeah.
The subtitles, yeah.
I don't think it does that.
Okay, shall we
Oh,
just
and
stick
this
to the
is a bit
video?
of a dick, but
So-
stick to the video if we don't have
Yeah.
audio.
Would you say that this tend towards epicness is just tending towards the monomyth, and that might be a flaw for some of these larger games?
It's definitely a, I mean, yeah, there's so much talk about the monomyth, and in teaching, I mean, when I'm teaching the class on my class on putting story in games, you know, like all the games books will say the monomyth. You know, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Star Wars story. It's, you know,
Hero's journey.
Hero's journey, whatever you want to call it. It's the little unknown guy who has some experience, forces him to go out and face death and come to terms with his father and various other things. It's essentially the adolescence story. It's going from being a child who is powerless in the world to being an adult and overcoming your father problems and blah 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 blah. It's all very Freudian, I'm sure. And this seems to be in the culture the only way that we talk about story and the only kind of story we talk about. And maybe when we get to extremes, the only story there is, kind of every story is this. And I think that's just bullshit, really. And we've done so many of those stories. That's not.
And it's certainly historically bullshit in terms of the idea of that I think we're so used to the stories now where you've got the little guy becoming the hero, which really wasn't a thing really in narrative until kind of Lord of the Rings, when you had the Hobbit
Have you
come
Tolkien?
through. And before that we're looking at stories of kings, fallen gods, powerful men, occasionally crazy women. You know, those were the story tropes we were dealing with before, but now we've got this one that's so strong and so I think accessible. I think its strength comes from how accessible it is because barely anyone, I hope, walks around thinking they're a fallen god or a king. So it's much easier to identify with. But yeah, I think it is an idea we keep coming back to, and it's an idea that turns up in a lot in games, and I think they often perhaps tend towards that epicness because when you're dealing with a character you're meant to directly relate with, the higher you can make the stakes, the more engaged you are. So if I'm going to lose a family member or blow up the world, I'm going to probably care a whole lot more than if I'm just going to miss out on, you know,
No, I don't think
losing
that's
a leg.
necessarily true.
Okay.
I think there are a few reasons for it. I think one of the ones is that feeling empowered is nice. You know, and video games are very good at doing that. And another one is that in terms of verbs, in terms of what players can do in the world,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to have a player shoot someone than to have them have a meaningful conversation with them, or you know,
Yeah.
be a good parent or something like that. And so those kind of very sort of broad action-oriented sort of verbs, those shoot, run, jump,
Yeah.
kill, lend themselves more readily to those kinds of stories.
I think it's also a nature of the medium as well, in that games are more visual than, you know, think of games as movies. You can't put like the depth of a novel or a relationship or a human experience. You can't express that on a screen as easily as you can an explosion, perhaps.
Yeah.
games are more dynamic. You need to see immediately something on a screen. You can't really express that in TV or commercials of a game. You can't really express the story in an easy way, I guess.
I also think it's just because, like, this is going to seem like a weird analogy, but bear with me for a sec. Does anyone know what a knuckleball is?
This sounds vaguely dirty.
I'm not talking about that type of knuckleball. Or a leather
Knuckleball's a
banister or
slow
a
pitch
reverse
thrown in
umbrella.
baseball.
Yeah, it's a pitch in baseball. Where all other pitches, you put spin on it, you throw it as hard as you can. So you got balls going down at 95 miles an hour, spinning, like seeming to defy gravity. A knuckleball is a slow ball that has no spin on it, so any eddy in the air will cause it to jiggle around. There are currently 2 people in Major League Baseball teams who throw a knuckleball.
Who's the second?
Oh, well, he just retired.
Oh, okay.
So there's now 1 actively knuckleballing. And the reason that people don't take up the knuckleball is because it's hard to pull back. It's hard to be slowed. And I think that's one of the things about stories in games. It's hard to be small. It's easy to be big.
Well, it's hard to be
Yeah.
small and interesting.
And interesting, yeah.
No, preach, man. I was wondering where that analogy was going, but when it came home, I was like, yes! No, you're right, and I
It
mean,
was a home run, you might say.
yeah. I mean, we talked about. I've not actually played it, even though I would absolutely love to. The Walking Dead seems an example where it's a game about zombies where none of the drama is in the zombies.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It's about human relationships. Yeah.
And that's
And it's
true
beautiful
across the
because of that.
franchise.
And it's not even a zombie apocalypse story. It's the zombie apocalypse happens in the periphery, and you have a story about people.
And as
Yeah,
good as
well,
that
it's already
game is,
happened. Like, that's what I love about it. Like, the apocalypse has happened. You fucked.
Yeah.
What happens now?
Yeah, it's a really good point.
But as good as that game is, and as wonderful as the characters and the relationships and the stories are, the gameplay mechanics are rather limited in their
Yeah.
scope. So maybe it's a case of the more detailed the story, the more simplistic the gameplay to an extent.
We don't have the tools to play with story. When we want to write a story in, it's very heavy-handed because it's like, here's a chunk of story and here's another chunk of story. Whereas we used to be able to play with something and have it sort of respond fluidly to us. These chunks, we either do this chunk or that chunk, and we can't mess around with that at that level. That said, we can do so. I mean, we've talked mostly about sort of authorial storytelling, but I think there's kind of like 4 different ways that games tell story. One is this kind of Mass Effect. We have a narrative to tell you, and you'll make some choices in it, but you'll mostly just play along with it, and that's okay. I like those stories. But then there's also the ones that just have, it's just sometimes just the story that comes out of the gameplay, like a game that has no, Tetris has no story, right? There's no plot about what's going on. But you can tell the story of the game of Tetris that you had, that you got up there and you were really close, and then you got this, you got the one long bit you needed, and it came back down again. You felt like a boss, and then you brought it right back to the bottom, and then and that's a story. It's not a story that you're going to write and be a bestseller, but it's a story for you. It's your story of how that game went. So you've got like this external story that's written on, then you've got this internal story of how it played for you. And the sort of the ludonarrative dissonance idea is when those 2 things aren't working together. When the written story tells you this mission is really urgent, and then the mechanics tell you go save the person or save it. But then I reckon there's other 2 that don't get talked about as much, which sort of come up. One is the exploratory story, like Myst or Fallout's vaults were very exploratory story. A story has happened here, and you're not telling the story. You're not being part of the story. You're finding the story, and that's a really fascinating way to tell stories. Is because you feel like you've discovered this story, and there's a mystery to be solved here. What the hell happened to these people that left the vault in this situation or whatever? And I love that kind of storytelling. And then there's like the DayZ thing where the game has no story, but people make stories out of the game.
Yeah.
And that also I find really interesting, that the game has enough in it for people to feel like we can just mess around with this thing and tell awesome things.
Yeah,
And
it doesn't have a story, but it has storytelling
It
tools.
has storytelling, yeah. It gives you a storytelling tool and says, here, tell a story with this.
That's why Minecraft is so successful,
Yeah.
I think, or at least partly the reason Minecraft is so successful. It doesn't have a narrative as such, but it has a variety of tools that players can use to construct their own narratives.
I think one of the interesting things with games that you perhaps don't get in other mediums is you can, that I'd even be able to play with something that's fluid, even when it's not fluid. You can play with essential factors that you couldn't play with others. So, has anyone here played Braid? Yeah? So that, well, lots of people, okay. So that's a really, probably quite a simple game. Probably wouldn't be one that would often get referred to in terms of strong narratives, but in that one you're messing around with time, but it's also that exploratory story idea because you're trying to work out what's going on. But the narrative is so tightly controlled that you have to finish the game to kind of know what's going on, and there's one twist in it as well.
And even then.
Yeah, even
Yeah,
then
it
you kind of
suffers-
go, huh.
Yeah, it suffers a little bit from to just quote Tom Stoppard, I think it was, like, what it lacks in depth, it makes up for in
Lack of
obscurity.
depth.
Yeah.
It's that.
It's one of those-
Well,
it's-
I get, and I mean, it's not so bad. I think he was trying to say something there. He just made it obscure, and it seemed, ooh,
You
look,
made it a little too
ambiguity.
Jonathan Blow.
But I do see a lot of my students try to imitate that and just, they don't know what the story they want to tell is. They just make it, ooh, look, ambiguous, and there's something happening. And I go, yeah, you don't actually know what the story is. And that really bugs me.
Yeah, and I think with Braid, what's interesting about it is that I got a really strong sense of this authorial control because I think I might have applied a backstory that's not accurate, but I think it was written partly as a critique against game development practices at the time. Is that accurate?
I think so.
Yeah.
So it's deliberately ambiguous and deliberately a little bit, so that we couldn't quite work out.
But the twist in that
What's
is a
going on?
beautiful example of gameplay and narrative coming together. In that exactly what you're doing in the game is what tells the story that he wants to tell you, and the realization that you have of the twist in the story comes out of the gameplay, and you just go, oh my god, I've been reading this entirely wrong, and I was blown away at that point.
But it's interesting because in this one, coming back to the idea of gameplay, kind of looks like pimped out that Mario games.
Yeah. Oh,
You
it's
just
very
kinda jump on
deliberately.
stuff. Which is interesting that the gameplay is quite simple, yet it can be used so effectively, and you get lulled into this false sense of security that you know what's going on, and then all of a sudden it changes slightly.
And I think he's doing something interesting here as well that you don't see a lot of, which is it's more about theme than about story. The gameplay, the playing around on platforms has nothing to do with the story. Like the actual level puzzles you're solving are really nothing to do with it. But they're about manipulating time, and the story is about time and memory, and you're not really playing the protagonist, kind of. You're playing with time and having a reflection on a story about time, and it's like it's a theme, not a the thing you're doing is in the same theme as the story you're reading. The thing you're doing is not acting out the story that you're reading.
I
And
think
you don't get a lot of that.
The problem I have with the game is that I loved it, absolutely loved it. I love the ending too. I think Blow actually went and muddied it by having the quote about
The atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb after that,
Yeah.
because it thematically changes what was an excellent story into, is this a parable of creating atomic energy now?
I have
And
a theory about
regret
that.
or something? Like, it just muddies the waters too much. Like, and I think that's like up to that point, yeah, it was thematically beautiful,
Yeah.
and then suddenly it's like, where are we going now? Like, what are you trying to say?
I think I know my response to that kind of ending, which has happened, the surprise ending where a whole extra theme's chucked in. There's often a sense of feeling a little bit duped and like it's a little bit gratuitous on behalf of the creator. That if they had really wanted to do that, they should have possibly woven it in earlier. I don't know, maybe it's just a hangover from debating where you never brought up a good point at third speaker because you didn't get a chance to engage with it. But it's the same thing, it's about keeping the story, if not the story, but certainly the themes clear so that the gamer can actually engage with them as they appear rather than just throwing them at you as you leave.
I think just in in general, that's your job as an author or a filmmaker or a game maker or anything. It's your job to keep all of these things in order in such a way that they, you know, engage the player or viewer or listener at the right times. And if the viewer is left feeling unsatisfied or duped, then it's poor authorship,
Yeah. Whereas I
poor
felt,
engineering.
I mean, I felt like I wanted to go back and play through again to like those moments where you want to go back and watch the movie again because you suddenly understand and you go, oh no, that casts everything that came before in a new meaning.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back through and go, wow, did I see what it was like to play with that? And that was a good thing for me. But yeah.
But did you?
I did, yeah.
Was it a different experience?
I found that I don't think my reading of the ending. I was hoping that the game. Actually, I was hoping the game would be a little bit deeper. That there would be another way of playing it. So anyway, my feeling is that the game. I have an interpretation of the game which isn't about the thing. What I think the game is really talking about is it's the difference between treating a person as a person and treating them as a puzzle, and that what you've been doing in the game is treating this woman as a puzzle to be solved, and the whole ending is not just about nuclear war. It's about that whole mentality that mankind has gone astray somewhere along the line, and rather than thinking about sort of things in a deep personal way, have pursued science and unpacked the understanding of the world, and as a result become monsters. I mean, and that's what the war quote, the monkeys quote, is all about. And then I realized that there was never in the game just have instructions. It doesn't ever tell you what to do or the puzzle that you're meant to solve. And then I went, oh, okay. It was up to me to treat this game as a puzzle. I came to the game and said, this is a puzzle to be solved, I'm going to solve it. And I wanted to go back and say, well, is there a way of playing this without solving the puzzle, like taking it in a different way? Well, that's what I hoped. Unfortunately, it didn't. If it's there, it's more subtle than I've discovered. John, if it's you've still got secrets hidden in there, I'd love to find out what they are.
And that puzzle with clues, and within those clues lies the story, can actually be a really satisfying model. There's a little game that Daniel mentioned last time we did this event that I went on and played. The sequel's called 30 Levels of...
30 Flights of Loving and
Oh,
Gravity's
that's
Yeah, and so that's an amazing game, both of them.
Yeah.
But it does that thing where it's a puzzle game.
Yeah.
But the level construction and design is so interesting and fun that you almost... And I guess it's quite rich in that sense that the level design is so good that you end up feeling like there was a whole lot more to it than the 20 minutes you just spent doing fairly straightforward.
Drinking lots of booze in this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This
pretty
is the one
much.
where you can whiff bits of orange people at people with square heads, right?
Yep.
Yeah. This
I
is
like that
just,
bit.
It's a good game.
just weird. But
They do. Square-headed drunk.
They're games that start you in the middle of the story and kind of get you to just after the middle of the story. They don't really complete
Yeah.
so much as end.
Like Pulp Fiction.
Gravity's Bone. But,
Pulp Fiction.
well, that tied up story arcs. This doesn't. It brings up story
How
arcs
many
and
people
leaves you to
played
think of
Gravity's
them.
Bone or 30 Levels of...
I played 30
Go
levels.
home and play it tonight, it's not long.
Yeah.
It's like 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Yeah, 20 minutes at most. Oh, maybe 30 minutes if you really suck at jumping puzzles. But Gravity's Bone, you're an assassin. You have to kill 3 people. You kind of, sort of, maybe work out why-ish. And 30 Flights of Loving, it's a heist game. The heist has failed. Kind of find out why-ish.
Ish. If you can work out what it all means.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating way of like introducing you to this. Like ultimately, both of them are narratives of failure. Like it's finding out why you lose.
Yeah.
It's not about winning. It's about discovering why you lose.
I also think it's, I've not played either of them, but I think they're really interesting examples of gaming discovering the short story.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
it very
Really
much
cool.
is.
Really
like,
cool notion.
When I played it, it made me think of a Will Self short story.
Mm.
Like it's kind of that real punchy, almost too clever for its own good.
And discovering also that, you know, the short story is a very different art form. It's not, you don't just stop writing at a point. It's you know, the same level of complexity and the same level of artfulness crafted in miniature. That's a very difficult thing to do.
I know that the tip that's often given to short story writers is you find a moment or a feeling and you build the entire story around that. And I think there are even longer games that do that quite well. I had probably the one emotional experience.
This is the bit I was talking
Portal.
about. Sorry. Whiffing orange peel later. Sorry.
So this is why I should go and play it tonight, so you can enjoy the orange peel. But that idea of that kind of emotional journey, like we've all been talking about getting really annoyed when our Mass Effect characters, you know, things happen to them, crying in video games. And that idea of the emotional journey that games can put you on, some do it really well in that terms of that one sustained feeling. Before the orange thing came up, I was mentioning Portal, which is essentially the one emotional experience the whole way through, which is pretty fun. And then you're totally psyched to do it again for Portal 2, but with this time with more characters. But I think there are games that will often have that, I guess, that more novel length or feature film emotional transition throughout it. And I think sometimes this is where cutscenes really come into their own, because you get a moment to kind of stop trying to work out what you do next and just kind of sit there and watch it happen.
I mean, they used to be also served as a reward back in the day when graphics were like boxes, C-texture boxes, and the pre-rendered cutscenes were this amazingly detailed world of characters that you were supposedly playing. So a visual reward in one sense, and yes, certainly a reprieve from the gameplay as well.
And you do, from a game developer point of view, get radically different approaches to story, because I often forget his name, which is terrible. The one who wants to be a film director.
Hideo Kojima?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just lost all my tiny amount of credibility. But in that sense, you've got someone who wants to have a very different reaction to story than, say, someone who's constructing a puzzle game. Oh, Portal. Well, this is also a puzzle game with clues, but a very different reaction to story and to gaming, and I guess to world design even, because if you're trying to, I guess, tell a film through a movie, you want it to be visually luscious as well, rather than, you know, the Portal aesthetic, which is probably quite, wouldn't have been too hard to design it because it's fairly stripped back the whole way through. It's such a shame you don't have sound on that computer.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the most beautiful moment in Portal, in my opinion, well, there's two, is one where you find that bit of wall sticking out. The first part where you see behind the scenes, and you've got that bit of wall sticking out, and then you go into the brown, go out of the white clinical thing into the brown, and you go, ooh, I've got into somewhere where I'm not supposed to, and that feels cool. And then later when you jump in the elevator shaft and get out of the, and get into the systems, it's like, to me it's the Die Hard moment. It's where you get out of the bit you're meant to be in, and you start to get into the bits of the building that you're not meant to be in. And that's a really interesting exploration feeling that you feel like you've broken the system in some sense, and you're
You've kind of left the game.
Yeah, you've left the game, and now I'm wondering.
What I like about Portal is that, I mean, aside from the fact that it does a really great job of sort of, as the writer Eric Walpole says, bridging the delta or lowering the delta between narrative and gameplay. One thing that I really like about it is that it knows when not to give you choice. So, for example, with the companion cube, you don't have a choice. You have to toss the companion cube into the incinerator. And because of that, it's a much more powerful moment than it would have been if you had been able to just take the cube with you. I mean, there are some moments in life where you don't get a choice. And I think video games and video game designers have this thing whereby they sort of go, well, interactivity is the defining characteristic of video games, therefore it should be present everywhere. Choice should be everything. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it depends on the kind of the experience that you want to provide.
it's also fundamentally not currently possible, I don't think, to give unlimited choice.
No,
Sooner
it
or
gives the
later,
illusion
you're going to
of-
run out of.
You have as much choice as they will allow you to have.
Yeah.
And interactivity doesn't need to be choice. Interactivity is just you're doing it. If the best, like the Blue Lacuna examples, the best examples I've found is where the game makes you choose exactly the thing that it wants you to choose, and then tells you to respond, and then responds to that. And it didn't. and when it doesn't feel forced, but when it feels, I mean, they very clever stuff in Portal. If you haven't watched it with the developers commentary on, play the game with the developers commentary, because there's lovely moments where they say, you know, players came into this room and didn't know what to do, so we put this ladder on the wall, which made them look up, and they went, oh, now I know what to do. And it's like, wow, they're messing with my head. I did exactly that. And I really respect that, because it made the experience much smoother for me. And doing what the game designer wanted me to do was what I wanted me to do at that time as well. And I'm glad that they didn't present me with the choice in a way.
I'm just conscious that I have no record of time. Gentlemen,
Yeah, how
does
we
anyone
doing?
have anyone? 8?
Great.
Right, we've got heaps of time then. In that case, it would be good to talk about that idea about choice or lack of choice, and how choice doesn't necessarily always equal interactivity and response. And I think one of the most powerful games to have done this recently has been Spec Ops: The Line. Who's played it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, you sound like you had a comment.
No, I have played Spec Ops: The Line, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was curious, because one of the things that's hardest in my experience is bringing together the players' sensibilities and the choices they make in the game. So how do you get the player to actually think closely about the situation in the game and do what they want to do, exercise their own, moral and individual faculties on that choice, rather than just the moment you get the option to kick somebody out of the window, kick that motherfucker out the window. So Spec Ops was a really, really interesting experiment where all of the choices were basically dilemmas, two-way dilemmas, and it actually, it gave you your instinct of whether. There's a really great moment, and I hate to spoil it, but there's a great moment where you're being pressed in upon by a crowd of angry civilians, and they don't give you any kind of
sort of cue as
to what you're supposed to do. And you can just open up on the crowd if you want to do that, rules of engagement style. Samuel Jackson's screaming in your ear, waste the motherfuckers, and you're going, okay. But they don't give you any kind of cue, but my first instinct was, okay, well, I'll give this a try. I'll fire some rounds over their heads. And they all turned and fled in terror. I didn't kill anybody, but I made my way out of the situation without any civilian casualties. And I thought that was a wonderful moment of actually tapping into my, innate moral faculty and having me do, that in the game to take what turned out to be the correct course of action in the game. And not many people managed to do that, but Spec Ops in that case at least did.
I like Spec Ops. I think it is way too heavy-handed in its treatment of the violence bad message,
Yeah.
because it entreats you to do all these things and says you're bad for liking this. Whereas something like more recently, The Last of Us does a much better job at taking the glamour away from violence just by making violence horrific. But what I really like about Spec Ops is that it's one of gaming's few examples of an unreliable narrator. Like you're playing this main character, you're playing through his story, through his eyes, through his memories, and they're wrong. Like, it's a really fascinating approach to telling a story, like the discovery that, basically delusion. Discovery that what you're doing is not what's happening. And it's also just to bring out a bit of my past life again. It's a nice example of free indirect discourse, which is like a writing style where the text is influenced by the personality of the character, even though it's not attributed to that character. Elmore Leonard does it a lot in his books, things like that. So one of his characters would use, some might use abbreviations that one of his characters would use, but it's just like omniscient narration. And it kind of works the same way in this, like when the main character witnesses these things, it's witnessed through his appreciation of how this would be, rather than how it actually is. So it kind of ties back into this unreliable narrator aspect of it. That especially when you discover how unreliable he is.
Be a
Well,
really
something-
interesting thing to trace game design pre and post Fight Club.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It's something that, like, Spec Ops
Unfortunately, it was
does.
Fight Club, the fighting game. So.
Spec Ops does something really well. Is what I think it does really well is that it withholds information from you that later recontextualizes the decisions you've made. And a lot of video games don't really do that very well. Like, for example, take Mass Effect. Whenever you do a quest in Mass Effect, for the most part, you're given a neat package of information. You know exactly who the stakeholders are. You know, they're always telling you the truth. No one ever lies in a video game, or at least not very often. And based on that, you know that if you make the right decision, it's going to have the right consequences. But, I mean, real life is actually a lot more complicated than that, and a lot more interesting than that. People lie to you. You don't always have complete information, or even, you know, a lot of information to go on before you have to make a decision. And I think it would be a lot more interesting, though perhaps frustrating in a mechanical sense, to not give the player everything they need to make the right choice, and then force them to make the choice anyway.
It's certainly frustrating from a gameplay sense as well. Like, you, maybe before you go on a quest, you want to know the information up front, and you need that clear objective to go towards. As a player, I think the sense of being betrayed or misled would be frustrating from the gameplay experience.
Yeah, well, I guess the problem is that in that case, you don't feel betrayed by the characters so much as you feel betrayed by the developers. There's that kind of disconnect there, and that's problematic.
I think I like to describe it as we don't need different kinds of games, we need different kinds of players. We've actually trained, the kinds of games we've given have trained players to expect a kind of thing, which means that now if we want to make different games, players can't play a different game in a way. We've trained people that this is what a game is going to give you, and this is the way, you know, you're going to be given a goal, we're going to put obstacles in your path, you're going to overcome those obstacles, you're going to succeed, and we'll reward you for that success. And well, that's the contract we have with you.
Yeah, that reminds me, do you remember that game Execution?
Yes,
yeah.
So that was an interesting game.
Yeah, basically there's this game called Execution. Have you guys played it? Have you ever heard of Execution? Yeah, basically what it is that it's a very simple thing. You start off, there's a guy tied to a pole, there's bullet holes all around him, you're given a cursor, a gun cursor, and you can either...
Actually looking down a gun sight, I think.
Is it looking
yeah,
down
I think
a gun
you're actually
sight?
moving gun sight.
Yeah, and you can either choose to shoot the person or leave the game, more or less.
Yeah.
And if you shoot the person, the game more or less moralizes at you and says, oh my gosh, what a bad thing you've done. And this is permanent. You can't go back and reload. The way the game works is that once you've made that decision, you can't redo it. But the thing is that, like you're saying, we've been trained to play games in a certain way, and when we're given the barrel of a gun and a guy tied to a thing and said this is a game about execution, your natural response is to click the trigger, and then to go, wow.
And we're also trained to then go, oh well, let's restore and play that again.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something the games will let us do. And story is a lot. I mean, that's an advantage in some games because it lets us explore different paths, and it deals a different way of storytelling because it's a lot of what if storytelling. But it also means that there's no tragedy that can be undone in a game. You can't kill this guy, and I love that the best moment of that game is when you quit and start again, and the guy's still dead, and you go, oh, what happened to my ability to go back and restore?
Tragedy is really hard to do in games. I don't think there.
I wanted to bring
really
up
been a
the
tragic
path.
game.
I think the path does tragedy pretty
Oh,
well. It's a Red Riding Hood game. Anyone played the path? Go play the path from Telltale Games. Telltale. I can never remember Tale of Tales or Telltale. Anyway, it's on Steam, but it messes with you because it's Red Riding Hood, and you have this scene where you're at the start out of the house, and there's a bunch of little girls all dressed in red with names that are also sort of red colours. You pick like Scarlet or Rose or whoever. And then you put on the road, and there's this long straight road in front of you, and there's this wood on either side, and the instructions come up saying, you know, go to grandma's house, stay on the road, and you do that, and the road is long and straight and pretty boring.
With many a winding turn?
No, it's just straight and wide, and you get to grandma's house, and you go in, and grandma's house is a bit weird. But not that weird, and you find grandma, you sit down, and the game ends, and it puts up saying, you have, you found Grandma's house, fail.
What?
Yeah, and you go, what? And you go, what did I do wrong? I did exactly what the instructions told me to do. And then you realise that what the game is really about is about breaking the rules, which is what Red Riding Hood is about doing, right? Red Riding Hood was told to stay on the road, and she didn't. And so you go, oh, what happens if I go over there then? And then you play the game again in a different way. And I love that because it's really interesting what happens next, but I'll leave you to find that out. But I love that because it knows that you've got that contract. It said, and it plays with that. It says, okay, we're going to give you a goal, and we're going to make it easy and boring to achieve that goal, and then when you do, we're going to tell you that you failed, and that what you were supposed to do is actually be subversive.
Did you feel annoyed with that when you got to the end and it said that you failed for following its
I don't think I
instructions?
felt annoyed. I felt,
How long did it take?
probably 5 minutes
Oh, well,
of walking down the road. It wasn't like, yeah, but it was, it was 5 minutes of just moving forwards and looking around and
I
going,
wonder how many people played that and just went, oh,
yeah.
what a shitty game.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was a real risk that they were taking, I guess, to do it that way. But for me, it made me went, okay, well, how am I supposed to play this game? And it aroused my curiosity, and then I found the game really rewarding once you start playing with that. But yeah, it was deliberately messing with you, and I like that. I mean, like in the way BioShock deliberately messes with you, as it knows the way that you're going to play the game, and then it goes, and it's a little bit heavy-handed, but it's kind of cool if you don't expect it coming.
I think maybe it's a rudimentary way, but it's maybe the only way we know how to do so far is for a game to sort of express tragedy or loss. It has to give you something that you rely on and then make you lose that thing or take it away from you. You'll see it in like RPGs like Final Fantasy, or my favourite example, Fantasy Star 4, where you build up your party and you level up your characters. Maybe one gets more powerful than the others, you tend to rely on them, but then the plot is such that that character dies. Like it's a major character that you've invested, emotional energy into and gameplay XP into, and then you don't have them anymore. You can't rely on that crutch, so to speak.
XCOM and Fire Emblem are two games that do that really well, in that you've got these grunts in your squad, and narratively, at least in XCOM, you don't really have any real reason to invest in them, but you come to rely on them mechanically because they're so useful.
And names rather
yeah,
than
exactly,
generic.
and they develop personalized stories. So like there was that one time that my character shot that alien from across the map, and it was amazing. And so you get invested in them because of that, via pure mechanical means. And then when they die, it's a real kind of impactful tragedy. It's like, oh my god, I can't believe I lost that guy.
Yeah. I played the old roguelike NetHack, like back in the text screen kind of days. ASCII art. And you are an @ symbol, and you're followed around by a little letter D, who's your dog, and it
you
kills
can have a
things
C
for you.
as well.
Oh, you have a K for a cat.
K, sorry, yeah, 'cause
that was
it
later
was,
versions, but the original version, you have a dog. And you could train it to attack monsters for you and pick up stuff, and you'd feed it and steal stuff from shops. It's great. You send your dog into the shop, it would pick up stuff and then bring it out, and the shopkeeper would be none the wiser. But then when somewhere down the line you're in a big battle and the dog's attacking something and some monster kills your dog, it's like, you bastard, you killed my dog! And you have this real attachment to the dog because even though it's just a little letter D that's following you around, but you played with it, and it's
It's the cheap way to elicit emotion in games. Children or animals.
Yeah, dog meat and Fallout, man.
And in Hollywood,
same thing.
in screenwriting rules, you can kind of get away with killing adults. Kids are often okay, but if you kill a pet, major problem.
Call of
Studio
Duty dog.
audiences
Call of Duty dog has a
hate
bullet
that.
with his name on it, doesn't it?
The use of children and animals doesn't happen often, but as soon as one of them runs onto your screen, you're like, oh, hang on, I have to probably play this a little bit differently. Which is why I thought the BioShock little girls, so really interesting was going on there. Where it's a little girl, but you're kind of given permission that if you need to kill her, it's okay because she's not really.
Well, they
She's
are
not
monsters.
really a little girl.
Yeah,
They're monsters.
You're kind
They've
of
been-
not also, because the game waves its finger at you if you do that.
Yeah,
Oh,
it does.
doesn't
I've actually
matter.
never been. I went back and got myself all psyched to actually harvest one and just couldn't get there because I'm a wuss. But you are given permission by the game, kind of. and it's within that space of it's a child, no, it's not.
But yeah, even if you accidentally harvest one because you pressed the wrong button, you're suddenly worse than Hitler. Like, there's nothing you can do to come back from that.
Yeah, which I think is a bit.
Yeah, the moralizing is too strong.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm working on a card game at the moment, actually, just a physical card game, but it's a zombie survival one. And I'm trying to build some of this ethical stuff into it. And there's a real, I find that there's sort of two modes of thinking when we approach games. We can think about, or just even in life, we can think about it as a problem to be solved or to be optimized, or as to engage in the story that we're being told. And one of the dangers of games is when we get too invested in optimizing our outcomes, and we don't think about the meaning of what we're doing, and we lose a lot of our storytelling capacity, because even if we do have a story there, people aren't thinking about it as a story. They're just thinking about it as a bunch of numbers and a mechanism for manipulating it, which is why I think ethics meters, good and evil meters, are bad, because they remove the meaning from good and evil by saying it's just optimizing a number.
You're min-maxing good and evil.
Yeah.
Something I think that does that really well, like a series that's done that really well since the beginning, is the Witcher series, if you've played any. The Witcher, based on a very popular Polish fantasy series. You play a mutant monster hunter. The Witchers are people who have turned themselves into something that's not quite human anymore through alchemy. They're stronger, they heal faster, they can see in the dark, they have special senses, and they hunt monsters. But the world of The Witcher is, I usually hate the term shades of grey, but you can never be sure of the outcome of a decision. It has a morality system in it, but never tells you what it is until the end.
About how many shades of grey are there?
Well, actually, yeah,
Hey.
with The Witcher.
Who was eyeing at that one? Come on.
Well, that's kind of true, because with The Witcher there is a hell of a lot of fucking. He kills monsters and bones women. That's his job.
Is that the tagline on the box?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
What's so
Yeah.
pretty?
So, the things that would normally be a very black and white moral decision in most things that have some type of morality gauge, go out and hunt a monster, don't hunt a monster. It's never that clear cut. You might go out and hunt a monster, find out that it's actually protecting someone who's being abused in the town. Or that by killing that, you're getting rid of the constraints from the hunter whose land it's on, who is a horrible racist and will then go out and kill the non-humans.
Well, it sort of goes back to what I was saying before about not having total information about what you're doing.
Yeah.
There's a thing that happens in Thief Deadly Shadows, which is the third game in the Thief series, which is basically you're a thief and you steal from people, and that's it. Where Thief Deadly Shadows departs from the previous games in the series is that it has an open world section where you can explore this world and break into people's houses and steal their stuff. And, that's good because you're a thief. But the thing is, there's one house near your own house where you break in and steal this stuff, and if you come back to that house later, you find a diary entry where the owner of the house talks about how poor he is and how he can't pay the rent now because some dickhead broke in and stole all his stuff. And it's sort of like, that completely recontextualizes the decision you've made. You're suddenly like, well, yeah, I'm a thief, but I'm stealing from people, and people have lives, and those lives are affected by what I'm doing. So it's a really interesting case of withholding information until the point where it becomes impactful for the player.
I've forgotten what. I was playing a JRPG, and the typical thing to do with any JRPG is go into every house there is, open every drawer, and steal everyone's crap because nobody cares.
Yeah.
But I've forgotten what game it was. But I went in and I did it, and the old woman in the house started crying, and I'm like,
Oh, wow.
and there's no option to give it back. So I'm just like,
I had
I didn't break into anyone's house after that and steal their crap, just because this wonderfully manipulative moment to just recontextualize what had become such an ingrained instinct in JRPGs, that houses are a free source of food, potions, and money.
Had a similar thing in Fallout 3. You know, the raiders are this big enemy at the beginning of the game, the big danger, and you mostly. But then I played one of the DLCs, and it was one that had the enormous level cap and everything. And so I was running around with huge weapons blowing, and I found this couple of one of the satellite anyway, a place that was a raider camp. And I went plowed through this building, killing everybody with ease and stealing all their stuff, and then walked out and just, I don't know what the designer was thinking when they did it, but just outside the door as you leave, there are 2 graves. And I walked past and went, oh my God, these are people who bury their dead. These are like, that somehow made them people to me rather than just units to be killed and to get money from. And I went, well, I'm the monster here. I'm the raider now that I was fearing at the beginning of the game, the person who just runs around and kills indiscriminately people who are just in their house doing their thing. And that
you give
even
someone
if
the
their
title
thing
of
is-
raider.
yeah, and it was
And,
all right.
it's
Suddenly
the-
they're all right. They're a unit that I can kill rather than the person that I relate to.
And I would suggest that what makes that particularly powerful is that the game didn't tell you that.
No.
You filled in the blanks yourself,
Yeah.
and that's something that you can do really well in games, and which is underexploited. I think you have this thing where the developers and designers and writers feel the need to tell you why you should feel a certain way, when really, if they construct the game in such a way, you can construct that for yourself.
It's the old writer's
older.
maximum of show don't tell.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we're so heavy-handed with our stories. Like, look, this is what you did, what it means. And it's like, if you can just show the people the consequences and let them notice it for themselves and draw their own conclusions, it can be so much more powerful.
So do you see a lot of our discussion revolves around knowing what to do and doing the right thing, and I guess that the gameplay aspects. What's really interesting, I think, about video games is that when you're trying to do story, I mean, you don't win at Anna Karenina, but you can win at a game. So you've got this.
I do. Have you not won, Anna Karenina?
Yeah.
It's
Always
amazing.
I'm on the high score table.
Yeah.
ACE, as always.
But I mean, you don't normally win at stories, and yet you win at games. So we expect. I mean, I think I had this became really clear for me when I played Dear Esther, which is it's not really a game, you just kind of experience it. You get to I'm like, well, that was nice. Sucked as a game. Because you are expecting game aspects to it. It's this, I think developers have this challenge of trying to marry story to games, which brings us back to that ludonarrative issue that some do quite well, but often the really heavy-handed narrative ones struggle to do that well.
Well, this is actually a really nice example of a game that, the story is very brief, it's beautifully told, and in between is the game.
Yeah.
Who's played Shadow of the Colossus? Fantastic puzzle game about climbing monsters and stabbing them in their weak spots. Like, that really is the gameplay. Here is a giant monster, climb up it, find its weak spot, stab it a couple of times until it dies. They're amazing, enormous, beautiful creatures, and it's a really satisfying experience bringing them down until you give them context at the end. And then you are a monster. You're just a horrible, horrible person. It's like the story only makes sense once you get to the end, really. Up until that point, it is straight gameplay.
During Bioshock Infinite, the story is incredibly heavy-handed, and it's like you can make moral choices, or you cannot, or you can do whatever. But in the end, the ending is always the same, and I think that the whole heavy-handedness of the story aspect, of the epicness of the scope and all that, is used as distraction for the actual meaning behind the story, which is it's all about this one guy's unwillingness or unableness to or destruction of his own identity through either one or the other.
Well, there is that, but I think like the entire Bioshock 1 and Bioshock 3, so Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, their stories about, ultimately, their narratives about gameplay. So the first game is about the illusion of freedom. Like, you're given all these options throughout the game, but you know, the twist is that you never had an option whatsoever. And the third game is all about inevitability. Like, you're given options, you make choices, but there is never going to be a different ending.
But there's also part of that, I mean, with Bioshock Infinite at least, it's about inevitability, but it's also about the kind of person you are that deals with that inevitability. Like, one of the very interesting things that I've found about Bioshock Infinite, there's a bit early on in the game before everything goes to shit, where you walk into a kind of a food co-op, and there's a donation basket there, and you can take the food in the co-op without donating, or you can take the money in the basket, or you can just, you know, leave. And I think that's kind of an interesting implicit moral decision, in that it's asking you, well, do you want to just be a prick and go and take this food and not give any money, or do you want to just take the money or not? And it doesn't have any real consequence for the narrative, but what it does have consequence for is the kind of character that you think you are in the game. It's more about building your identity within the world rather than having a tangible effect on the narrative.
At that point, do you know enough about your character to make that choice, or are you acting as a player?
Well, you're acting as a player to build that character. So you don't know enough about that character, but you're making him. You're making your particular take on Booker DeWitt.
Yeah, I've got a comment on the amnesia trope in games. Let's move on, people. I mean, it serves us well because you're at the beginning of a story, and yet you want the player to be able to decide who they are, especially in role-playing games. So let's give them amnesia, and then that'll be an excuse for them not to have any backstory. And I think that's really it's just trite, but it's also not. It doesn't mean that you're a very interesting character. Even looking at the monomyth and the hero's journey, there are things lacking from our hero's journey games that are in the hero's journey, and one of the main ones is the establishing of your life before the call to adventure. Like you know, the hero, like the Hobbit, the Hobbit has Bilbo has a life in Bag End, and he is established as a character with an everyday life, and he's attached to that life. And the call to adventure, you know, he resists that because he doesn't want to do that, and it gives him a personality and makes what happens afterwards meaningful, because he's always desiring for what was at Bag End, and he's thinking about that. In games, they throw you straight into the call to adventure. Nobody in their right mind resists the call to adventure in a game, because isn't that what the game's about? That's the interesting part.
Press B to resist, game over.
Yeah. Which I thought...
Would you like to come and say so?
Yeah, but it's interesting that it means that there's very little... Your character has no background and no...
Fallout 3 does a reasonable job.
Fallout 3 does a good job of that, because you feel like you've been kicked out. You know, you're attached to the vault, you're attached to your growing up in the vault, and then you're kicked out, and you resent being kicked out of the vault. And your relationship with your mate, you know, when you finally track down your father and you only want to say him, "You bastard, you ruined my life," and he goes, "Oh, I need you to do this thing for me," and my response was, "Well, fuck you," and I went off and did my own thing for a while, and then finally came back to that scene, partly because I knew it had to continue the game, but partly also because I felt that, all right, Dad, I'll do what we have to do. Is like this obligation, this family obligation that was hanging over my head all the time that I went out and did my own thing in the world. In the same way that it was a gameplay obligation that was hanging over my head. And so I did this stupid thing, and then he went and got it. Oh.
So yeah, I'll go back to Planescape Torment again, because that's a game with an amnesiac character. But kind of the point of his hero's journey is finding out his backstory.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting way of tackling that initially everyman, amnesiac, you know, blank slate character,
I don't
but
have a
giving him
particular
that background.
Yeah, I don't have a particular problem with it. I think it's a really fundamental thing in the toolbox. You know, slow exposition about a character. So long as it's done well.
If you do it well.
Yeah, the
there's no
question is
problem.
whether it's done
I
well
think
or badly. It
and
seems
if-
trite if it's done badly.
And if there's enough to the character.
Yeah.
Because the point I stopped pretending I was excited that Bioshock 3 had come out was when enough information came out about Booker that I'm like, I don't care. This isn't you. I don't like you. this game is annoying. Like that was the point at which I went, actually, like for me it was hinging on the character, and when he emerged I didn't, I think that was the make or break factor.
So did you prefer the sort of empty cipher approach in the original Bioshock?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're running I think when you create a character, and the character is driving that narrative, if there's not enough to them, I don't think it works. I mean, I quite like mute characters. Like, I mean, I liked Gordon Freeman. I liked Sheldon Portal. Like, those guys were great because there was enough coming from the other side that you knew what was going on.
Yeah.
I just thought Booker, there was not enough to him. There was not enough reason to like him. I didn't know if that was a gender thing, given women don't get the best shot in a lot of games, and that is normally where I would identify. And I thought Elizabeth was far more fun, and actually wanted to be playing her.
She was a much more interesting character, I think, than Booker in that game. Well, I was disappointed by his lack of character in the end, that he was sort of he was just influenced. Things just happened to him rather than him really making decisions in the game, I felt. And even when you discovered who he was a person that things happened to. And I went, oh, oops.
But on that note, I think we're going to open up for questions. There's been hands popping up and comments from the audience for most of tonight. There's one there. Let's go.
Hi. My question is, after Robert Ebert's death, I finally got around to trying to understand what he was saying by saying games aren't art. Now I've come around to the point that I agree with Robert Ebert, and the reason is...
Roger.
Sorry. Is that there is a categorical difference. Now, I happen to think that that's the solution to, the tension between ludics and narrative, which is one is they're categorically different, and therefore we need to take an entirely different approach. Responses, I guess, is my question is: does that seem logical? Is that illogical for some reasons? Are games categorically different to art?
No. Art is a bigger, in the sense that the music is categorically different to writing, but they're both art. Okay, gameplay is different to writing, is different to music, is different to visual art.
Yeah,
but it's an art.
different to a play, is different to stand-up comedy, is different to improvisation.
And
but they are all art forms.
My only response is that historically, every time there's been a debate about art or not art, the side saying not art has been wrong.
I think often it comes down to art is about art's about trying to say things in an accessible way.
Art's accessible?
It's about saying in a way that engages.
Engaging rather than
engaging,
accessible.
Saying in a way that is accessible, that reaches people and touches them. And I think games strive to do that. I think they often do that beautifully.
Well,
simply from an aesthetic point of view, and in new ways. And they're expressing a lot in multiple ways.
Ebert's argument was the lack of authorial vision in games. That because you weren't directed to a specific end, or either left open to entirely your own, interpretation, that it couldn't be art, because those are the two kind of benchmarks of art at the moment. So you appreciate an image and you're drawing your meaning from it, or you watch a movie, you read a book, and you are taken on an authorial vision. Whereas with games, you kind of do both simultaneously. Like, you take things from the gameplay that you don't get from the story. You may not have a story at all, because you might be playing bloody Tetris, which I think is a work of art. So how do you categorize it? It's too broad a category to say no about. Yeah, I don't think, some games I don't think classify as works of art, but gaming as a whole I think is an art form.
But neither do some books and some
Yeah.
films and
Yeah,
some
exactly.
software.
I mean,
Matthew Riley.
It's sort of pointless to debate mediums. You look at specific instances
Yeah,
of the medium and then
specific
decide
instances, yeah.
are they art or not.
Yeah, and I think it's also...
To say the games don't have authorial vision, every game designer I know has an authorial vision.
Yeah.
Whether they succeed in communicating it, some do and some don't. But they know what experience they want to have, and they design their game to give a
Towards that
specific
experience, yeah.
experience.
And I mean, it's probably a fairly, in terms of authorial vision, gaming is one of the more collaborative
Well, I
sense
think
making
that's
processes.
what Ebert was getting at, was that because you're not being directly led because you have input, the authorial vision isn't absolute.
Yeah, but authorial vision is never absolute.
I mean, especially if you look at the
Well-
context in which art operates now, which is, since the 70s, and certainly postmodern visual
Yeah,
art, so those
exactly.
rules no longer really apply. That's not how art works now.
Yeah, post death of the author, the whole idea of sort of, intrinsic authorial vision is nonsense. People
So-
interact with everything that they read or consume.
But I guess gaming makes it more overt because there is a literal interaction.
Yeah, there's a literal interaction, whereas like you're talking about a movie critic who is used to sitting for 2-hour blocks and seeing someone's vision.
And who has never played a video game, by the way.
Who has never played video.
But so we all uniformly disagreed. Did you want to come back?
Yeah, well, because that wasn't the only point that he made. He said since games have a win-loss state, they
Not all
Not all
of them
games
do.
do. Minecraft doesn't have a win-loss state.
Well, you could consider not building anything a type of a loss state.
No, I wouldn't
No.
consider that a loss state. I consider that player doing what they want within the confines of the system.
Well, then is that a simulation?
Well, that's
Instead
kind of
of
a messy
playing
area when you're getting into the differences between simulations and games. I would say Minecraft is a toy more than anything else.
Yeah, well, because, I think, if you think of all the parts that are expressive of games outside of the ludics, I would say that all of those things are art. I'd say ludics is different, like a piston, right? You might say the design of a piston is art, but that piston is functional in an engine, and in that case it's not art.
I don't think function necessarily precludes art, though.
And I think there are plenty of pieces of legitimate high art that are functional as well. I mean, look at there's a whole interactive art scene.
Architecture.
Architecture is a
architecture.
Dang.
architecture.
And even purely in that, the machinery and art conflict, I think the entire futurist movement was obsessing over machinery and the capacities of that, and there's no way that doesn't count as an art movement. So perhaps you could argue that the particular tool isn't art, but what comes from it, which is essentially what you're doing in a game, you're not looking at the mechanics, you're playing the mechanics, you're living those mechanics in the simulation.
This is really in danger of becoming a definition debate.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
yeah.
next
Yeah, if
question,
you
at the
show-
back,
Can I
British.
get a show of hands of how many people would like to ask questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at least. Okay, so just
Red t-shirt.
Hi, I'm Jacob, filmmaker, nothing to do with games. Are you saying that in filmmaking you say drama, conflict? Are you saying by using tools of, as making an interaction or making a puzzle, there's a conflict there, so you're creating drama?
Sometimes.
Can I-
Yeah.
I speak to that as an example from doing my own design. So I'm working on this, like I said, a zombie card game, and I was doing my research and watching zombie films, of course, and there's a lovely moment in The Walking Dead where we're trying to spoil the whole thing, but two guys are limping away from an enormous horde of zombies that are about to eat them, and they're not going to make it. And one of the guys turns to the other guy, and they're going, "We're not going to make it. What are we going to do?" And then he shoots the other guy, so that the zombies eat his body, and he gets away. And it's about that moment of that difficult decision, and then making the immoral choice of killing your buddy in order to save your own hide. And I wanted that in my game. I wanted that moment of drama in my game. But the way the game design is, you don't write that. Whereas what I try to do as a game designer is design the forces on the player to get the player to make the decision that person made in that situation. And so I designed the game so it's a multiplayer game. There's situations where two players are trying to get away from a bunch of zombies, and the mechanics are such that if one of the characters attacks the other and that guy dies, then the zombies are more likely to eat that, and he's more likely to get away. And I set up all the rules, but I never explicitly program that situation. There's not you turn over the card and it is this scene. But what happens out of the rules is that every now and then two players find themselves in that situation, and they look at each other, and one of them will go, wait a second, if I kill, and then they'll do that, and then they have to live with themselves afterwards for what they've done, because after the other guy goes, I can't believe you killed me, and it's like, I had to do it, and so there is real drama there, but the drama, what I'm fascinated by is gameplay, essentially, this ludic thing that we have, that is this different thing, that isn't storytelling in the ways we're used to, but we can still tell stories with it by setting up the story and getting the player to live out the story and live out the dramatic decisions. And there's been beautiful moments in that game where these things have happened, where like one of the game is it's a terrible tragic game where almost every time people will die. And like I had one where they were fighting a last stand in a church, one guy with a chainsaw slew, and then finally the last person died, and there's one guy left and he's about to die, and rather than let the zombies eat him, he takes a Molotov cocktail and firebombs the church and burns the church down around him, and that's the end of the game, and everyone died in this conflagration of death. And I never scripted that. I didn't think even to conceive of that situation, but it was beautiful to see that story being told out of my game, and to see them put together the pieces and the forces that would normally be the forces that were on the protagonist in a story, and the reasons why that protagonist did it. I put those forces on the player and made the player make up their own mind what to do in that situation. And, you know, in the killing your buddy moment, it could have played out differently. One of them could have said, all right, I'll stand and fight, you run, and that would have been another story. And that's what I love about, you know, really good gameplay, is that these different stories can come out of the player's decision of what they're going to do and whether they're going to be the good guy, the bad guy, all these different kinds of storytelling that we try to borrow tools from outside and write a story, and I think gameplay is our unique art, and I think we can do some really fascinating things with it. Sorry, I'm blathering now because I'm really excited by that.
So presumably you'll be selling copies of this card?
Yeah. So I'm running a Kickstarter soon to...
All right, next
you can buy the
question.
game with the concession desk at the back.
Hands up.
Yeah, I
More
think you're...
questions?
Yes.
This might be a really sort of touchy subject.
Good.
So with what Malcolm said just now, what role do we see in traditional writers, like traditional linear writers? Are they still? I mean, I suppose they're still relevant if you wanted to do a linear story and it's a game. But like, if you wanted a really dynamic situation like what Malcolm's game is, like, other than just bouncing ideas off of them, what role is there for a traditional writer? Like, do traditional writers
like
need
like a story
like a book person,
prose writer?
Script person?
Yeah, I think we've got a much broader cultural
Can you
question
repeat
about
the question, please?
Oh, so the question was, given there's such different storytelling challenges for games writers, what role can traditional fiction writers play in that? Is that a fair representation? Yeah, I think we've got a much broader conversation around what the role of writers are in our society in general. I think, when we ran this event at the Writers Centre, we probably a lot of the members probably had never thought about writing a game. I think it's probably quite a different skill set, and I think it's probably I think if someone who was writing a short story then wanted to go on and write a game, I have no doubt they could do that and bring the emotional connection that they're striving for and the understanding of momentum. There are a lot of skills they can bring with them, but it's a very different form. And I might actually throw to Dan, who writes both games and fiction himself.
I mean, having worked for a couple of large development houses, you do spend an awful lot of time feeling very unnecessary. But that's okay, because you've got games like Malcolm's and games like DayZ where all of the narrative comes out of the gameplay. It's like you're saying, it's the developing narrative. That's perfectly fine. That narrative, I don't want to play DayZ because I'm not a crazy person. all of the narrative, but it's still fascinating to me that the narrative comes out of that game when somebody comes in and writes it up, right? I love reading stories about EVE Online, but god damn if I'm going to play EVE Online, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, firstly, there's still facility for people to make big cinematic games of the kind that I really want to play and that I'm really going to enjoy. And secondly, I think there's space for people to, you know, in the same way that there are such things as sports writers, you know, who construct the narrative around, and you know, they enliven the game by constructing narratives around teams and seasons and comeback stories and all these wonderful narratives. I think there's the same facility for the same thing around these particular types of games that you're describing.
One of my friends who is a writer has been who's played the game has written up the story of his experience of my game, which was really fascinating to see. And I don't think the kind of game that I'm making is the only kind of game that can be made, and I think we tend to, in these discussions, we can tend to say, oh, there's only one solution, it's this. You know, we can have all these different kinds of games and they're fine, and some of them, but also I think that you've got to recognise that writing is a craft that's more than just putting words down on paper kind of thing, you know, writers, the tool set of writers is all of this thinking about dramatic construction and thinking about that, and all of that knowledge has to go into doing the kind of design that I'm talking about. It's only through my experience with writers and learning what those tools are that writers use to construct a story, and then I think, okay, I want to do those same pieces, but I have a different medium in which I do it. It'd be the same as a writer going from writing, you know, writing a novel to writing film. You have to learn you have a different form, but the story, the elements of story are still the same. And so all those skills of knowing about how to tell a story and what a story is,
Hands up again.
I don't think they're wasted at all.
Okay. Cardigan. In the middle. Blue cardigan. Long brown hair.
I was wondering, what do you think is more effective for video games designers? So sort of leaning towards the psychological guessing game where you're trying to come up with things that the player will sort of, you know, do and sort of lead the story on that way, or creating a sort of open world where there's like endless possibilities and you'll sort of play
It depends on what kind of story you want to tell and what kind of
That's much
experience you want
longer.
to facilitate. If you want to tell a particular kind of story, if you have a point that you'd like to make, or a series of events that you want to narrate, then obviously, yeah, you would lean more towards the former. Whereas if you just want to give players the tools to create their own story, then you would naturally lean towards the latter.
Or allow them to discover the story.
The open worlds are also really good for the discovery kind of story. Just wandering, there's something really special about wandering into an area and going, oh, there's a story that happened here, and that's...
The other thing you should remember from the perspective of a writer is that stories aren't made out of ideas, they're made out of stuff. You know, so you don't start off thinking, I want to write a story about individualism. You say, I want to write a story about a rock singer.
So
and you
I guess it
discover
comes down
the
to
theme of what you wrote.
The theme
themes
comes
will
afterwards,
emerge.
and you can
It
definitely
comes out of
play
what
around
you're
with that.
writing, yeah.
You know, you can angle towards that. You can try and bring it out in all sorts of ways.
I'm not sure that's
But
necessarily true.
stories are about stuff for me.
Well, stories are about action.
Yeah, but I think you can start with a particular theme or a particular agenda. So, for example, Dostoevsky wrote all his novels with the clear intent of expressing a particular theme. And he used the stuff in them to more completely express that theme and to humanize it. So I think, yeah, you can start from an ideological or thematic perspective and then build from that.
Yeah, I think you can. I think so definitely in children's and young adult fiction, but also in adult fiction, there has been a move away since Dostoevsky, away from ideologically driven stories.
Yeah.
People don't like them as much. I mean, we talked about heavy-handed narratives with Spec Ops and Bioshock. Modern readers do go, oh, it's a bit, you know, stop telling me what to think. But I think it ultimately comes down to, if you want to create a world that's about an open world that's about exploration, or if you want to create a game that's more psychologically taught, it comes down to what you want to write, because there's certainly space for both. There are certainly players looking for both. So, oh god, there's more of them.
They breed.
Oh, look.
Would you go through that
execution game before.
Yes.
That was really like impactful that you could play it more than once.
Yes.
And do you think games are too forgiving in that sense? Like, if you could only play Facade once and only go through that entire situation once, I think it would be a completely different experience than it is at the moment. That you can just go through and do everything you want to do.
Great idea. This disc will self-destruct in
Yeah.
5 seconds.
There was harder for the player to appreciate the depth of such a game if they don't get to experience and discover that depth. I mean, part of the fun in Facade is to see what else you can do, see how much freedom you have. If you don't get a chance to sort of manipulate the game to utilise that freedom, then the message is lost.
Yeah, so one of the things that games really offer us is that ability to say, what if, how would this have been different if we'd done something different, which, traditional narrative can't do. So it's kind of a power of our work, but it is also the curse in that it loses a certain forcefulness if you can always go back and undo what you did.
Well, I looked at a really interesting iPhone game maybe 2 years ago. That I don't know if it was ever released, but do you know what Cannabolt is? It was a running game like Cannabolt, like jumping between buildings. But it had constantly updating leaderboard, so people who got the furthest. But the interesting thing about it was you could tap the screen to stop. So the idea of the game was to get furthest, become top of the leaderboard. And the further you get, the more precise your jumps have to be, the longer they are. And you had 1 life. If you lost that life, you'd have to buy the game again. And you are taken off the leaderboard.
Wow.
Wow.
So
What a business model.
it made your decision to stop when you think you've done enough to top the leaderboard really important.
That's
But
fantastic.
if someone gets
So
above
cruel.
you,
Then you gotta-
suddenly you're like,
Yeah. I think it's an underexplored
$2.99.
space. I think we can do more. We can say more if we're less forgiving. I don't think it means every game has to be. Some games, fine, it's good.
I think I'm inclined to think that the solution should be that the player is less forgiving on themselves. I don't think it should necessarily be extrinsically imposed on the player. I think if you construct your narrative and your world in such a way to make them not want to go back on their choices.
Yeah.
I think that's
I felt
probably
in Heavy Rain the first time that I failed at one of the quests that the main protagonist is sent on, and the game kept going, and I felt, okay, I will play with that failure, and I'll live through that failure and see what that means for my character. I didn't feel at that moment that I needed to go back and go to the save point and succeed at every single mission, and partly that was, I noticed that at the time. It was, but it was a conscious decision to, no, I'm gonna let this sit with this failure and go on. But it didn't force it on me. I could have gone back and played the thing again. So.
well, it's also sort of contingent on the notion of failure. Like, failure doesn't necessarily have to be total failure. There can be benefits that also have negative consequences. And I think the trick is to sort of create situations, like for example, I don't want to spoil it, but in Mass Effect 3, there's a decision that you make that could end up resulting in the death of a valued team member. And ultimately though, the decision is the right one to make ethically and in terms of the narrative, I think. So even though you failed insofar as that your team member has died, then it's still not a complete failure, so you're more inclined to move on with the game and accept that failure and play with it in a sense.
Yeah, we have such a total idea of failure in games usually that it's just like if you don't play it perfectly, then it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
well, I'll go back to Dark Souls again, because that game is about failure. It's about learning from failure. Like, you're not expected to survive. I mean, the tagline for the game is "You will die." So combat is extremely hard. You're never really told where to go. You only learn that by going and doing things, and you will die, and you'll have to retrace your steps and fight the same monsters again, but you'll have knowledge that second time round. But failure also becomes a reward later on in the game, because you can use failure as a way of accruing resources, because when you die, the souls you have collected are dropped in the place you die. So if you can find a nice farming spot, you can farm to a certain point, die, start at the beginning again,
Oh,
kill
man.
your way through, and get double the souls.
I never thought of doing that.
Can I
So-
just finish your point and then one more question?
So, it's a really interesting approach to failure. It doesn't make you want to fail, but it means you appreciate the fail state.
And even just having the ghosts and stuff there is sort of a reward for failure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Failure is not just your
You
failure
can
has
see
an effect
someone
on the
else's
world.
failure
Yeah, and you know,
and-
failure is intrinsic in that
Yourself,
game because
yeah.
it's all over the place and you can see it. It's not just.
It's
Like, a lot of failure is sort of swept under the rug by going back to before you failed and then pretending that it never happened. Whereas that game embraces that and says, "Look, people are failing all over the place."
Okay, final question.
Last question from Dan Grant.
Hang on.
Thanks. Hopefully this will be an interesting one.
Yeah,
So
no pressure.
you guys have spent quite a bit of time tonight talking about characters in games, and the cipher, like love it or hate it, is really often the main character of the game, someone you can project into, someone who has kind of a very agreeable, a very neutral position. And the story's laid out for them, and they typically, I find, in books and movies, the main character is the one with the strongest arc, the person who goes through the most change throughout the story is the person you identify with. Whereas in games, often this cipher, like the main character in a lot of AAA titles, is the agent of change who pretty much doesn't change a great deal. They get stronger, but their alignment never changes, they never have a change of heart, they never change their mind about their view of the world, they pretty much stay focused on their goal from start to finish. And I find that this is not a great device for bringing about change of heart in someone who's experiencing the story. If your goal is to try and, I don't know, affect people and bring about change of heart, what's the best kind of character for your game?
Well, so you
With
don't.
the goal to create that the player experiences a change of heart about the game world
If
or
you wanna
about like
reach
a
people with
broader
something.
issue.
I'm not very fond of the whole of the cipher trope.
Neither am I.
I think it's pretty weak by and large. What I'm more interested in is getting players to adopt a role, adopt a character, and then try to understand the world from the perspective of that character and understand how their interactions with the game world change them. So, in that sense, you're not changing the player, you're changing the player's understanding of the character and the role that they're playing. You can't really do that when it's a cipher because you're not really taking a role, you're just being a nothing, a non-entity.
I think the cipher thing. I mean, I think I've made a comment before that there's a couple of non-speaking characters that I've really enjoyed playing, and I think those characters worked because there was enough feedback that I got a sense of the character. I think at the end of Bioshock 2, and I'm running around putting on the suit, I think that's when I began to feel the lack of character because there wasn't any. The bit where you're running around finding the suit bits, you don't actually interact with much at all. So I think provided you're aware that it's a role that you're creating rather than an empty person that you're enacting, I think ciphers can work if there's enough around them that it's clear that people are relating to you and therefore there's an implicit, you can at least mentally you're relating back.
There has to be enough meaningful choice so that players can define their identity through those choices. And the thing with Bioshock is that the only really meaningful choice you get is whether or not to harvest the Little Sisters.
And it's not a meaningful choice.
Yeah, ultimately
anyway,
not that super meaningful.
because the reward you get for harvesting them, you are rewarded more if you don't.
I think I don't know that I would call the character from the first Bioshock a total cipher, because I mean he has character, he has tattoos on his wrists, he has this little box of memories that you look at the start. The fact that he doesn't, I think there's certainly a spectrum of ciphers, and like the total cipher is Gordon Freeman or the character in Skyrim, but you're able to do, you're able to give people enough character that they can latch onto. Like with Booker, like with the Master Chief.
Yeah,
Give
Master
people
Chief
enough
is-
character that they can
is a
latch onto,
cipher.
but still feel some separation.